The hospital bracelet was still on my wrist when my husband told me he wasn't coming home that night. I was sitting up in the hospital bed, our daughter finally asleep against my chest after 6 hours of labor that had left me feeling like I'd been turned inside out. My hair was still damp, my hands were shaking slightly, not from pain, but from the kind of exhaustion that goes all the way down to your bones. Lily was 7 pounds, 4 ounces, and she smelled like something I didn't have words for yet. I kept pressing my nose to the top of her head just to make sure she was real. My husband, I'll call him Marcus, was standing by the window in his jacket. He'd put it back on. I noticed that first, before I noticed anything else. The jacket meant he was going somewhere. I said, "You're leaving?" He said, "Just for a few hours." His voice had that particular evenness it got when he'd already made up his mind and was simply waiting for me to catch up. My dad called. They want to celebrate. The whole family is at Harmon's. You know how hard it is to get a reservation there on a Friday night. I looked at him. Then I looked at Lily. Then I looked back at him. Your family's at a restaurant right now. Celebrating. Without us. He said, "Well, you can't exactly go. And the baby needs to sleep anyway. I won't be long. The baby." He called her the baby. She'd been in the world for 4 hours, and he hadn't used her name once. I said, "Marcus, I was discharged in 3 hours. How am I supposed to get home?" He said, "I already called the hospital transport service. They'll arrange something. It's very standard," the nurse told me. He kissed me on the forehead, quick, practiced, the kind of kiss you give a person when you're already mentally somewhere else. Then he picked up his keys, my keys, the ones to my car, the Volvo my father had bought me 2 Christmases ago, and he walked out. The door clicked shut with a sound that was almost polite. I sat there for a long time. Lily made a small sound in her sleep. I pulled her a little closer and I thought about the past 3 years. Really thought. The kind of thinking you avoid when life is busy and full and you're always one step ahead of the quiet. I thought about our wedding, which had been beautiful. I thought about the apartment we'd moved into together, which had been his idea, in a neighborhood I'd never quite warmed to. I thought about the promotion I'd turned down 18 months ago because Marcus had said the travel would be too much, would put too much pressure on us, and I'd believed him. I thought about the savings account I'd started with my own money from my own salary, that I'd never told him about, not because I was hiding it, but because something in me had quietly understood that I needed something that was only mine. I thought about all of it, and I thought about my daughter's face, and I picked up my phone and I called my father. He answered on the second ring. He always answers on the second ring, my father. I used to think it was habit. Now I think it's something more intentional than that. I said, "Dad." He said, "Sweetheart, how is she?" I said, "She's perfect." And then I started crying, which I hadn't done through any of the labor, not once. He waited. My father has always known how to wait. I said. Marcus left. He went to dinner with his family. I need someone to take me home. There was a pause that lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then my father said, "I'm already in the car." He arrived 40 minutes later with my mother in a car seat we hadn't even known he owned. He'd apparently bought it 3 weeks ago just in case and kept it in the trunk of his car without saying anything about it. That was my father. He prepared for things quietly and didn't make a production of it. My mother took Lily and held her against her shoulder and walked slow circles around the room, humming something low and wordless. My father sat in the chair beside my bed and looked at me for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "Tell me." So I told him. All of it. Not just tonight, but the 18 months of small things I'd been filing away and trying not to look at directly. The way Marcus had gradually taken over the finances, not dramatically but incrementally, one shared account at a time, until most of our money flowed through him first before reaching me. The way my name had been removed from our lease renewal and I'd only found out when the landlord sent an updated copy. The way Marcus's name had appeared on the beneficiary line of my work life insurance policy without my having changed it. I'd noticed it on a routine HR email and told myself it was an administrative error, that I'd fix it. And then I hadn't fixed it because fixing it would have meant admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. My father listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react visibly. which was somehow more frightening than if he had. When I was finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you still have access to your individual accounts?" I said yes. I'd kept them. My savings, my work account, my investment account from before we were married. Separate, in my name only, untouched. He said, "Good." He said, "I need you to trust me for the next 24 hours. Can you do that?" I said yes. He picked up his phone and stepped into the hallway. I could hear him speaking in a low, even voice, not urgent, not emotional, just precise. That was how my father handled things. He was not a man who raised his voice when something mattered. He got quieter. My mother came and sat beside me. She put one hand over mine. She said, "You did the right thing calling him." I said, "I should have called a long time ago." She said, "You called when you were ready. That's all anyone can do." We brought Lily home that night, my parents and I, in my mother's car while my father followed in his. Marcus's car, my car, was not in the parking garage when we left. I noticed the empty space and felt something settle in me that I hadn't realized was unsettled, something like clarity. The apartment was quiet when we arrived. My mother made tea and found the bassinet we'd set up in the bedroom and transferred Lily into it with the certainty that only grandmothers possess. My father sat at the kitchen table with his phone and his reading glasses and made 3 phone calls in the time it took me to shower and change. When I came back out, he looked up and said, "I've spoken to Daniel." Daniel was my father's attorney, not a family friend, a professional, someone my father had worked with for 15 years on his business dealings. I'd met him twice at company dinners. He had the kind of careful, unhurried manner that made you feel like every sentence he spoke had been considered from multiple angles before it arrived. My father said, "Daniel will be here tomorrow morning at 9. In the meantime, I need you to write down everything you told me. Dates, specifics, anything you can remember. The lease, the insurance, the accounts." I said, "Dad, what are you thinking?" He said, "I'm thinking that a man who leaves his wife and newborn daughter alone in a hospital to go to a dinner reservation has been practicing a certain kind of carelessness for a long time. And I'm thinking we should find out exactly how practiced he's gotten." Marcus came home at 11:15. I heard his key in the lock and I was sitting in the living room with the lights on, which I think surprised him. He probably expected to come home to a sleeping apartment, to slip in quietly, to address everything in the morning on his own terms. He stopped when he saw me. He said, "Oh, you're up. How'd you get home?" I said, "My parents brought me." He said, "Good, good. I was going to check on that." He set his keys on the counter, my keys, and shrugged off his jacket. He smelled like wine and a restaurant, warm bread and something expensive. He said, "How's she doing?" I said, "She's sleeping." He said, "Great." He opened the refrigerator and stood looking into it. I said, "Marcus, I'd like you to take your things and stay somewhere else tonight." He closed the refrigerator slowly. He turned around. He said, "I'm sorry?" I said, "I'd like you to leave." "Not permanently. Not yet. I just need tonight and tomorrow to myself. My parents are here. Lily is fine. I need space to think." He looked at me for a long time. I recognized the look. It was the one he used when he was recalibrating, deciding how to approach something. He said, "I think you're being emotional. You just had a baby. Your hormones are—" I said, "My father is in the guest room." "I'd rather you didn't finish that sentence." He went quiet. Something shifted in his face, some small adjustment. He looked toward the hallway. He said, "This is my apartment." I said, "It's in my name. I checked the lease renewal this morning. You removed yourself." I watched him realize, very slowly, that he had made an error. Not tonight. Tonight was just the night it had surfaced. The error had been made over time, in increments, in the assumption that I was not paying attention. He left without saying anything else. I heard the door close, and I sat there in the quiet, and I breathed. Daniel arrived at 9 with a colleague, a woman named Priya, who specialized in matrimonial asset law, and a leather folio that contained more paper than I expected. They sat at my kitchen table and my father poured coffee, and they asked me questions for 2 hours. What they found, methodically and without drama, was this. Over the course of our marriage, Marcus had established a pattern of financial arrangements that consistently moved resources in his direction. A joint account, opened in the first year of our marriage, had been used to funnel a portion of my direct deposit through a linked savings account. Also joint, but one I'd never been given login access to. The amount wasn't large enough to notice month to month. Over 3 years, it was substantial. He had listed himself as co-owner on the vehicle registration for my Volvo, the car my father had given me before we were married, using a form I had apparently signed at the DMV on the same day we renewed my registration, along with several other documents. I remembered that day. I remembered signing a stack of papers and thinking nothing of it. He had also, Priya told me carefully, applied for a credit card in my name approximately 14 months ago. The card had been opened, used, and the minimum payments made from the joint account. The balance was not small. I sat with that for a moment. I said, I never applied for that card. She said, I know. My father said nothing. He was very still. I said, what does that mean? Daniel said, it means we have documentation of identity fraud, which changes the nature of this considerably. I called Marcus that afternoon. I used my own voice, steady and even, and I told him I'd spoken to an attorney. I told him I knew about the account, the vehicle registration, and the credit card. I told him that Daniel would be in contact with him before end of business to discuss next steps, and that I was requesting he not return to the apartment until we had a written agreement in place. There was a long silence on his end of the line. He said, "You're making a mistake." I said, "I don't think I am." He said, "I was going to tell you about the account. It was for us. It was going to be a surprise for a vacation I was saving for." I said, "Marcus, don't." Another silence. Then he said, "Your father put you up to this." I said, "My father picked me up from the hospital when you didn't. The rest I did myself." I hung up. Lily was in the bassinet next to me, awake, looking up at the ceiling with that new, unfocused gaze that babies have, like they're still deciding what the world is going to be. I picked her up and held her and thought about the word my father had used the night before, when Daniel had called to confirm he'd reviewed the preliminary documents. He'd said, "This is going to be fine." Then he'd looked at me and said, "I want you to hear that. Not fine eventually, fine. You have more ground under your feet than you know." I hadn't been sure I believed him then. I was starting to believe him now. The next 72 hours moved the way urgent things do, faster than you expect, with a kind of momentum that makes each step feel both inevitable and unreal. Daniel's team documented everything. The credit card application, filed online, using my social security number, my mother's maiden name as the security answer, my date of birth, all information Marcus had access to. The linked savings account, which had accumulated over $41,000 of redirected funds over 38 months. The vehicle registration change, buried in a stack of DMV paperwork on a Tuesday afternoon. Priya was precise and unhurried. She laid it out without theater. She said, "The credit card is the most serious. That's a federal matter. How you'd like to proceed on that is entirely your decision. There are civil and criminal avenues, and they don't have to be pursued simultaneously. The financial recovery through civil action is relatively straightforward given the documentation. The other piece is a choice only you can make." I asked her what she would recommend. She said, "I'd recommend making sure he understands clearly what you have and what you could do with it before he makes any decisions about how to approach the dissolution. Information changes negotiations." My father, sitting across the table, permitted himself a very small smile. Marcus's attorney contacted Daniel 2 days later. The conversation, from what Daniel relayed to me, was brief. Marcus was prepared to agree to an uncontested dissolution, return full title of the vehicle, repay the redirected funds with interest, and resolve the outstanding credit card balance. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue criminal charges for the identity fraud at this time, with the understanding that the documentation would be retained. My father said, "Is that what you want?" I thought about it. I thought about Lily, asleep in the next room. who would one day be old enough to understand what a father was and what he'd chosen to be. I thought about the $41,000 that was coming back to me. I thought about the car that was mine again, cleanly, on paper. I said yes. I think so. I think I want to move forward, not backward. He nodded. He said, then that's what we'll do. The paperwork took 6 weeks. In that time, my parents stayed close. Not intrusively, but in the way parents do when they understand the presence is the thing. My mother came 3 times a week and held Lily while I slept. My father reviewed every document before I signed it and explained each one in plain language without condescending to me about it. Marcus and I did not speak during this time, not directly. Everything went through the attorneys. I didn't have strong feelings about that. I'd found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't have much feeling about Marcus at all anymore. Not anger, not grief, not even the low-grade unease I'd been carrying for the past year without acknowledging it. What I felt instead was a kind of spaciousness, like a window had been opened in a room that had been closed for too long. The morning the final paperwork was signed and processed, I was sitting at my kitchen table with Lily and her bouncer on the floor beside me and a cup of coffee going cold at my elbow. My phone lit up with a message from Daniel. All filed. Congratulations, it's done. I sat with that for a moment. Then I picked up my phone and called my father. He answered on the second ring. I said, it's done. He said, how do you feel? I looked at Lily, who was examining her own hand with intense concentration, opening and closing her fingers like she was testing a theory. She had my eyes. I was slowly realizing, quite a lot of me in her. I said, I feel like myself. Maybe for the first time in a while. My father said, good. That's what I was waiting to hear. There's a version of this story where I stayed quiet, where I told myself the taxi home wasn't that big a deal, that he'd make it up to me, that I was too tired and too emotional and too new to this whole thing to trust my own instincts. I know that version well. I'd been living inside it for the better part of 3 years. But here is what I know now. On the other side, the moment he walked out that door with my keys and went to celebrate without me, something in me that had been very patient finally stopped waiting. I didn't blow up a marriage over a dinner reservation. The dinner reservation was just the night it became impossible to look away from what had been building for a long time. I called my father because I was tired and because he was safe and because I didn't know what else to do. What happened after was not some master plan I had. It was simply a series of honest conversations between people who cared about me, followed by good documentation. Lily is 4 months old now. She smiles at the ceiling fan like it's the funniest thing she's ever seen. She grabs my finger and holds on with a grip that surprises me every time. She does not yet know anything about the world, what it asks of you, what it takes, what it's possible to get back. I have some time to figure out how to tell her. What I know I'll say someday is this: know your own value before anyone else gets the chance to set the price. And when you're at your most exhausted, most vulnerable, most undone, pay attention to who shows up. That is the information that matters. My father showed up. He always has. The rest, I'm learning, is details.